Hello, my name is Thomas Linton, and I would like to have a discussion series on um, apologetics, and specifically, I want to do a critique on this book here called "Reforming Apologetics" by J.V. Fesko. Now, J.V. Fesko is a Reformed uh, theologian. Historical theology is his expertise, and that's seen made evident in his book on apologetics. Um, and he's attempting to argue that the classical approach to apologetics, called classical apologetics, is the apologetic method that has been around the longest, which is it's true. It has been around really long. It was accepted by all the reformers. It is the method that essentially, I mean, for a lack of a better term, that is endorsed by the confessions, and that presuppositional apologetics of Cornelius Van Til is an apologetic method that's come around very recently and is not consistent with the Reformation, and is not consistent with confessions and historical Reformed orthodoxy. Now, in my opinion, Fesko does not accurately represent Cornelius Van Til. In fact, I think he misrepresents Van Til on a number of issues. One being he assumes that Fesko assumes that Van Til and Van Tilians believe that we only get knowledge from the Bible, which is incorrect. And he made this comment in a interview he did with Carl Trueman. I believe it was on Mortification of Spin podcast, and there's just a horrific interview. Scholars should know better than to conduct themselves in such a way. So I wanted to point that out front. But before I get too much into the book or start evaluating the book in Fesko's apologetics, I want to do a quick overview of the apologetic methods of what it looks like to do presuppositional apologetics and what it looks like to do classical apologetics. So what I'm going to do is start with classical apologetics. So classical apologetics takes a two-step approach towards arguing for the Christian God. The first approach is to argue for the God of what's called the God of the philosophers, or a general theism. This approach takes on a few different arguments for the existence of this God, namely the cosmological argument. The William Lane Craig has made popular what's called the Kalam cosmological argument. And the argument essentially is that the universe had to have a beginning, and a personal agent had to have been the cause of this, and this agent is God. So there's a number of premises and a conclusion that are made that show that, well, the universe had to have come into existence, and God is the cause of that. Another argument is the ontological argument. The ontological argument is similar as far as arguing to a general theism, and it argues based upon the greatest of all beings that we can think of, and that essentially from this greatest of our thinking of the greatest of all beings means that this greatest of all beings must exist. And then there's a teleological argument that argues essentially for the purpose of the universe. So the universe has a telos, a meaning, a purpose behind it. It's not just a random accident. So this idea of purpose in the universe is another attribute that they say, well, this proves that there must be a creator of the universe. Another argument they use is a moral argument, and that there has to be moral laws, absolute objective moral laws that are not just created by man, but are eternal, that are argue that this argument is for the existence of God. God's the author of these laws. And then there's a design argument, the design of the universe. The universe shows elements of design in it, and because of this design shows that the fine-tuning argument is also called the fine-tuning argument, that the universe has such specific specifications to it that require a designer, which is God. William Lane Craig also uses what's called Reformed epistemology, which has been made popular by Alvin Plantinga, but specifically the element of religious experience that we have. We are warranted in our Christian belief and our experience, and so those all tend to argue for a general theism. What William Lane Craig says is the God that Islam, Judaism, and Christianity can all accept. Now, of course, Christianity believes in a triune God, not a Unitarian God. So it's not the God that Christianity accepts. It's the God of the philosophers. It's not the God of Christianity. But they take a second approach. The second approach to add on. So it's the first block. The first block is general theism. Then it's the second block is trying to get to the Christianity, and they argue this by way of a resurrection defense. So what the classical apologists will do now that they've established this general theism will now argue for the historical evidences for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And it's believed that, well, if you can provide enough convincing evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, then you have to believe also that Jesus is God. Now, that's an assumption they make. You have to take a leap, because you could say, technically, that, well, he got rose from the dead, but he's not God. So that is a jump that has to be made, but they believe that you can use sufficient evidence in historical evidence, use secular sources, Christian sources, non-Christian sources, and show that there's it's reasonable to believe in the resurrection, that there's reasonable proof to believe in the resurrection. And this is essentially what classical apologetics does. Classical apologetics uses these two approach method. The first, arguments to general theism, and then arguments to the historical reliability of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This has been made. This idea of the resurrection defense is very popular today among Andy Stanley has been on this unhitching, as he uses the term, the resurrection from the revelation of God in Old Testament, New Testament, which I find odd because the Old Testament prophesies of such an event of the Messiah. So I don't know why you'd want to do that, but there are Christians out there who are saying that that's a good approach to take for apologetics. Now, I want to say this, that the classical apologists like Fesko have to acknowledge and accept as their own apologists like Andy Stanley, William Lane Craig, J. Warner Wallace, Frank Turek, Norman Geisler, R.C. Sproul. R.C. Sproul's a good theologian. Most Reformed theologians admire R.C. Sproul, so that's not a bad thing. I'm just saying these are all people they have to accept as their own. Those are the classical apologists. Now, presuppositional apologetics is more recent, within the last 100 years. Cornelius Van Til, who was the first professor of apologetics at Westminster Theological Seminary when it was formed in the mid-1920s by J. Gresham Machen, developed a method known as presuppositional apologetics. Now, this method is supposed to be built upon a biblical approach towards apologetics. Now, what there are some key tenets of this method that need to be mentioned. Okay, first is presuppositionalism says that God has made himself known through creation and nature. That's general revelation, and supernatural revelation in the scriptures, and that all men know God. So it's not that men have an excuse to not believe in God. Everybody is accountable before God because they all know God. Now, what presuppositional apologetics by Van Til's Apologetics does then is takes the scriptures from Romans 1, where it says that they suppress the truth in unrighteousness, that they're without an apologetic before God. Now, this is what presuppositionalists say is all men know God, but the unbeliever, the person who's not a Christian, is suppressing that truth in unrighteousness. Now, a lot of people say, well, the unbeliever says he doesn't believe. And he does. We're right in saying that they don't believe. Greg Bahnsen, a Van Tillian scholar, who was probably the best student of Cornelius Van Til, said was that it's like a ball being pushed under the water. And eventually it pops itself out and hits him in the face. Van Til used the analogy of a child sitting on their father's lap, and they have to use their sitting on their father's lap. That they need that in order to slap their father in the face, and that's what the unbeliever is doing. So the idea is that there's self-deception going on in the unbeliever, that they really do know God, but they're suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. The other key factor of presuppositionalism that needs to be mentioned is what's called the myth of neutrality, and that is that nobody is neutral. Okay, we don't just because an unbeliever is assuming neutrality. No, they're not neutral towards God. And what Bahnsen would say is the unbeliever's not neutral towards God, and we shouldn't be either. So we shouldn't try to take a position that somehow we're going to use common ground as far as we're going to use the same, reason and all that to argue to God. What Van Til is saying is they already know God. We don't need to argue to God because they already know God. What we have to do is expose the folly of their worldview. Okay? And this is done in different ways, but one of the arguments that Van Til and Bahnsen and other presuppositionalists use, it's what's called the impossibility of the contrary, arguing from the impossibility of the contrary. So what it is what they're saying is that the Christian God exists, has made himself known, has revealed himself. The Christian God's also the triune God, right? And this triune God represents and fulfills the philosophical problem of the one and the many. Now, the one represents oneness in the world, and then the many represents diversity in the world. We refer to the universe, right? One and many. Now, this is a concept that's not really addressed today in philosophy, but in the history of philosophy, it was. And what Van Til and other presuppositionalists say is that this unity in the Godhead and this diversity in the Godhead explain the problem of the one and the many, and that all acts of predication have to involve the one and the many. So what the argument is that any act of predication assumes unity and diversity. Okay? Predications that attempt to deny the triune God of the Bible presuppose unity and diversity, and therefore also presuppose the triune God of the Bible. So that's essentially what the argument from that's called the transcendental argument from the existence of God too. So one of the many is this one. You can also argue from logic, that logic is a transcendental, whereas logic, the existence of logical laws, the laws of logic, mathematics, principles of mathematics, principles of induction that we use to do, the uniformity of nature. These are all things that we cannot prove, and in philosophy generally they're just accepted. And the reason why they're accepted is that's the only way we can avoid external world skepticism. We avoid thinking that we're, what's called solipsism, that we're just the only minds that exist, because we can't prove anything else. So you have to make a lot of assumptions. And what presuppositionalists do is say, well, these assumptions that everybody else has to take for granted can be explained through the triune God of the Bible. So that's what presuppositionalism does. Presuppositionalism is not saying that that we only gain knowledge from the Bible. We recognize that God has revealed himself in creation as well as special revelation in Scripture. So that idea does not hold any water. So what I've done so far is presented two different approaches towards apologetics. The one being classical apologetics, that's been the most popular today. And then presuppositional apologetics. Presuppositional apologetics has its roots in Cornelius Van Til. Like I said, he was the first professor of apologetics at Westminster Theological Seminary. He decided to, in his apologetic method and readings and studies, he read on two schools of thought. He read Herman Bavinck, Abraham Kuyper, and what's called the Old Dutch Reformed school, also called today, a lot of people refer to it as Neo-Calvinism. So he read those folks, the Dutch old Dutch Reformed, and then there's also what's called Old Princeton School, which is B.B. Warfield, Hodge, Charles Hodge, and B.B. Warfield are the two, probably the two main figures in that. And Warfield was a big classical apologist. So what he saw was he developed his apologetic by looking at Kuyper, Bavinck on the one hand, and Warfield Hodge on the other hand, and then also he was very influenced by Geerhardus Vos. And if we understand the theological influences of Cornelius Van Til, then we understand his apologetic method. What Fesko and others have attempted to do is they solely look at what they think is philosophical influences. So let's say that Van Til was just borrowing from idealism and Kant and Hegel, and he wasn't real. All he was doing is borrowing from them and developing the transcendental argument from that. And that's not accurate. That's not accurate at all, because he was taking the theology of people he highly respected from two schools of thought, as well as Geerhardus Vos, who kind of represented both. In a way, he was a Princeton Theological Seminary, but he's also Dutch, so he represented both. And so what Van Til did is, he, being the bright mind he was able to see the benefits of these two schools of thoughts of Princeton Theological Seminary, the old Princeton Guard, and the Dutch theology, old Dutch theology of Kuyper and of Bavinck. And he was able to see the benefits of both. And then he was able to develop this apologetic method from that. And what he saw from Kuyper was the antithesis, that there's two opposing views going on. The worldview of the unbeliever and the worldview of the Christian. And we have to push the antithesis, is what Van Til would say, and what Bahnsen would say. So what I want to do my next time is get a little bit more into Fesko's book, introduce it, talk about what it entails. But today I wanted to discuss the differences between the two methods, because before I want to dig into, I want to make sure that I explain what I mean by presuppositionalism and what I mean by classical apologetics, because once I get into it, I won't be explaining it as much. Thank you very much.